Sure.
Perfect.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. So this webinar is part of the Clinical Faculty Development Series that the Alliance for Clinical Education has been organizing. My name is Irene Alexandraki, and I'm at Texas Tech University Paul Foster School of Medicine in El Paso. So today I will talk a little bit about instructional methods, and I will try to highlight how we select instructional methods in a way that will optimize medical student learning. And before I begin, I want to let everyone know that this activity is actually designated to receive 1 credit hour AMA category. So you can claim that CME after the activity. So a little bit about the faculty development series that ACE has been organizing. So the overarching goal of this initiative is to provide faculty development to a broader audience. So the audience includes all medical educators, those who teach medical students, residents, fellows, and also faculty. And that could be academic and also community faculty as well. So it is a 3-year series. There are 9 webinars per year. You can see there isn't going to be one next month. And also no webinars in July and August. You do get CMEs. And those take place on a second Thursday of the month, and it is at 1 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. So the content is really based on the guidebook for clerkship directors, the 5th edition. So my presentation today will be based on the content of the respective chapter in the guidebook. And just a little bit, some highlights here you can see. So there is a series of webinars. You can see the first 2 that already took place, this one today, and then there are wonderful topics coming up. And this is the 101 series. Then there is the 201. So as you can see, those start in September of next year. And they go up until June of 2023. And then we have the 301. So as you can see, very interesting topics starting in September of 23, and then go up until June of 2024. So this is the book that I'm sure you are all familiar with. So the content will be really based on what is included in the respective chapter, which is chapter 9, Instructional Methods and Strategies. So before I begin the presentation, just to highlight what the objectives would really be today, it is a very, very broad topic, and I know everyone has a lot of expertise already, so I'll just try to provide a brief overview of the instructional methods that we commonly use in undergraduate medical education. talk a little bit about how we could think about selecting the most appropriate teaching method, and then discuss some teaching strategies that could promote active learner engagement and also allow some time for the learner to synthesize and also reflect. And I would be curious to know from our audience, which organization do you belong to?
Are you able to see the results, Irene?
Mm-hmm. I should end the, okay. And then share.
There we go.
Can you all see the results? So it seems like the majority, actually, they are not from any of those organizations. That's great, 63%. And then we have from 16% from STFM, and we have 6% from CDIM, and APCO 9%, and then the ADM-SCP 6%. That's great. So we have a lot of folks from none of those organizations. What would be your primary leadership role in medical education? I have here, some really, clerkship director, sub-I director, or any other UME leadership, or you're more involved in GME, or perhaps you have some sort of a dean's position, or if none of those are applicable, you can say other. I see that everyone is already responding. That's great. It looks like we have 39% of clerkship directors, and then we have almost 20%, 19% other UME leadership. Some have a dean's role, and actually majority, they don't have a primary leadership role in medical education. That's great. That's a nice mix. So the instructional methods, just a little bit of a background. As we all know, when we think about instructional methods, what's really our overarching goal is to promote learning and make sure that the medical students, they do develop proficiency in competencies that they're essential for patient care. So we want them to be able to have that competency and provide high quality, evidence-based, compassionate patient care. So I know that all of us, we always, have this dilemma. How can I deliver this particular content? And what teaching method should I use, and what would be the best one to choose? So I think the first thing that we all have to think about is our learners. So it will be very different the way we design a session if we have a first or second year medical student versus a fourth year medical student who's close to graduation, for example. So the level of the learner and also the particular needs of the learner. And we also have to keep in mind that all the learners, they have some prior experiences, they have some prior knowledge. So what would that be? How I can take that into account and build on that prior knowledge? However, we also have to keep in mind that learners most often have also gaps in their knowledge. So that's another important piece to really know what those gaps are and how can I deliver that content in a way that I can close those gaps. The other important aspect is that it's really not just delivering the content, but then allowing the learner to synthesize it, have some opportunity to apply that content to new cases. If it's a basic sciences, for example, content, how can the learner apply that to a clinical scenario, for example? And also allow the learner to reflect and help the learner to build those skills for self-directed and lifelong learning. So our goal is really to help the learner move from that dependency stage where the content, the learning is sort of passive, to more self-directed learning and cultivate that lifelong learning attitude. And other important aspects of the selection of the teaching method is the content. I mean, there's so much these days in any area, in any discipline. So how much do we want to deliver? In what depth? And this is something that you have to think about. It will be very different how you deliver a topic to a first-year medical student, when you really want to highlight the basic science aspect versus similar content for a third year where you want to highlight more the clinical reasoning and how to apply the basic science content more to a clinical scenario or a patient's presentation. And it's always the time and the resources. These are always things that you have to keep in mind, and they can be quite challenging considering time constraints and also constraints in resources. So when I start thinking about a teaching session that I want to deliver, I always go back to Bloom's taxonomy. And I'm trying to think, okay, so I have to teach medical students. So what is the level of the medical students? Do I want them to sort of understand some concepts? Do I want to make clear some specific, areas in basic sciences? Or do I want them to analyze? Do I have more advanced learners? So I expect them to be able to analyze, be able to evaluate a patient. So based on that, and those are just some examples, you can try, different teaching methods, but if your goal would be more to sort of help the learner, the early learner understand, perhaps, a large group session or assigning, some readings or some online videos or modules, versus if you want the learner to learn to sort of go a little bit more in depth, put the dots together, analyze, evaluate, then simulations, real patients, those are going to be more appropriate teaching methods. So the So as you can see here in this diagram, so it's actually quite complex, the planning of a teaching session. And I know all of us, almost on a daily basis, for those of us who teach students, we always encounter this dilemma. So how can I balance all those different aspects of the planning? So we have the learner who is here at the center. And as I mentioned earlier, the content, so how much of this, in what depth? And I think what really helps is to have very clear, very granular learning objectives. And this is very helpful. It's helpful for the learner. It's helpful for the instructor. If you're, the clerkship director and you have assigned content, for example, to different teaching faculty. And also considering that our students, they are often rotating at different teaching sites, it really helps the instructors, the faculty at those teaching sites. What would be the expectations that the preceptor, for example, would have from a student? It will be very different if you have a preceptor who's working with a first or a second year medical student versus an advanced learner who should be able to formulate a plan and have a solid differential diagnosis versus the first year medical student who's in the beginning of training. So, you wouldn't expect that student to be able to analyze and come up with a treatment plan at that point in the student's training. You also need faculty who are really skilled because it does require a lot of practice. And in the clinical setting, it's even more challenging with, the pressure that there is to have a very, very busy schedule, taking care of patients, teaching, multiple tasks and multiple responsibilities. So this is where faculty development comes into play, really to support the faculty so they are able to deliver that content and help the learners. So there is tremendous need for resources, and this is where the institution also really needs to support the program and also the faculty development. You also need a lot of resources if you will have an online presentation, for example, that these days with the pandemic, we've been using the online modality very often. So you need IT support, for example, and then the time. So the time is always an issue. That's why I think another consideration is, you always have limited amount of time, so you can blend different modalities. So if I'm not able to deliver all the content, then I will ask the students to go online on the learning management system and watch some videos or use a discussion board to stimulate some discussion about a topic. So you can always blend also the teaching methods to fully deliver the content that you want in a way that it's meaningful for the learner. And the setting, that is something also very important. And I have a very simple example here. So if my goal is to teach a learner, an early learner, how to read an EKG, then even a small group session or in the clinic or on hostel rounds, that might be a good venue to do that. But if my goal is more, I'm emphasizing communication skills, and I want to see how the student will be comfortable discussing, the care for a patient who presents with acute coronary syndrome and refuses treatment, then a better modality would be a role play, for example. So next, I will talk a bit about the types of instructional methods, just highlighting some of the main instructional methods. And I would like to ask the audience, so from the following instructional methods that you see on the slide, which one do you use most often?
Okay.
That's great. So it seems that almost half they teach in person small groups, only 3% online. So it seems like almost everyone has shifted back to in-person small groups. And a lot of clinicians, I see 16% teaching in clinic. We also have some hospital-based, so 6%. And 16% lectures. That's great. It's a good mix. So I will begin with, the large group teaching. So as we all know, this is one of the oldest pedagogical methods. And I guess one advantage is that you have all the students, they usually sit in a very large classroom or in an auditorium, and then you have the instructor and delivers the information simultaneously. Although, simultaneously these days that a lot of those lectures are non-mandatory, the presentations are recorded, so often the learners might watch the presentation asynchronously. But it is the same content essentially delivered by the same instructor. However, if we think about this, there are some disadvantages. So the learning could be quite passive. And there are fewer opportunities for the teacher to interact with every student. It's also hard when you teach a large group to know if they're engaged, if they're following, are they really understanding, are they sort of have a sense of what I'm talking about. And it might not be a good teaching modality if your goal is to teach skills or attitudes, or your goal is to teach high order thinking. So what are some ways that maybe you can make your large group teaching more engaging? I think key, and it's not unique to the large groups, but it's really for any teaching modality, is to have very clear learning objectives and to make those available at the start, but ideally before the session. And now that everything is online and we use learning management systems, it's good to post everything online, all the materials, so the students can review ahead of time And they usually come in and they bring their laptop and they have, the presentation open in front of them. And if it's a slide presentation, they'll take notes. So that keeps them more engaged. And also using visual aids. The audience response system is a good way to keep them engaged. Recording the session for those who are not able to attend. And also often the quality of slides. If you have too many slides and you just, read the slides, they become very quickly disengaged. And some, things that I'm sure you're all aware, the size of the font, the clarity of the slides. If you have images, they always like images. So those are some things that you can make the presentation itself more engaging. And for all those things, you do need very good IT support, because if you're running into problems and IT cannot get to the classroom on time and students are just waiting, this is not very good for the large group session. And some things to stimulate their interest is really to ask some questions. When I'm asked to teach large groups for first and second year, I always build a presentation around cases. And I often do those together with the basic science faculty. So I will highlight the case, and then the basic science faculty will go into more depth into the basic science content. And then we'll sort of apply that to the clinical case. And students really like that. And I can ask them questions and I can keep them engaged. And also they can start thinking a little bit, even in their first year, like physicians, they can start thinking about, what is going on? What could be the etiology? What kind of diseases could, present that way? So that might be a way to make the large group more engaging. And there are some other ways, and I don't know how many of you have tried in a large group, the BAS groups or the think, pair, share. So, they can think and they can talk to their, classmate next to them, and they can brainstorm, and then they can share with the large group. So those are some of the things you can consider. However, you always have to be very mindful of time, because you also have so much time. It's usually an hour, but you don't want to go over time. And actually, you don't want to use the whole hour. It's good to leave 10 minutes, or if you can, maybe 5 minutes at least, to wrap up the session, highlight some key points, and also leave time for the students to ask questions. So those are some things that you can try in your large group sessions. Now, small group teaching, and as I saw, majority of you're experts, you are already teaching in small groups. So this is a way that could promote easier communication. Learners could become more actively involved in the small group session. They can tell us what they think. They learn to listen. They present their ideas, and they also learn to work as a team. And it's also a way for them to assess themselves. They see how their peers, what they know. And, sometimes that could be it could prompt them to go back home and study because they realize that they're behind. However, this sort of very idealistic description of small groups, in order to happen, I think it requires a lot of effort from us as facilitators. So I think it's very important in the very beginning to set some ground rules. I mean, what would be the expectations? What are the tasks? And every time I teach in a small group, I always start with the learning objectives. What are we going to learn today? What topics are we going to discuss? And also the structure of the small group. And it's always important, similarly with the large groups, to have all the materials available in the learning management system well ahead of time, so the students can come prepared, unless it's a PBL session, for example, which I will talk about the PBL in the next slide. The other important aspect of the small groups is really the learning climate, because if it's threatening, if they feel unsafe, they won't participate. It's hard for them to open up and share their thoughts, their perspectives. So creating that very inclusive environment, that it's non-threatening, that everyone respects each other. So I think that creates an environment where there is good discussion. And also the facilitator should always try to make those group discussions constructive and also positive. And challenging sometimes could be balancing group dynamics, because you might have one or two students and they dominate the group. So you have to try to keep the balance and keep the student who's very quiet, who's maybe uninterested, try to engage those students so everyone participates. And to do that well, I think it's also there are some logistics. I mean, you want a small group, which is not, it is a small group. So really between 8 to 12 students. If it's more than that, then it's probably too many students for a small group. And sometimes things that, like the configuration of seats, for example, that I have here, I mean, if they sit around the table instead of one student behind the other, that's not going to be very conducive for participation in a small group. And a little bit about the some of the types of small group teaching that I know most of you are already familiar with. So problem-based learning, that's a good modality if you want to integrate basic and clinical sciences content. For those groups, though, as a facilitator, you really have to take a step back and just sort of let the group run the discussions. It's usually a case, an image, it could be an article, and the students, they come in and they are not prepared. So this is all new knowledge for them. So it requires some effort on the part of the facilitator, because sometimes you want to, direct and guide the learners, because sometimes they can be a little bit off track, but you really have to take a step back and let them, brainstorm and think a little bit about what is going on. It could be quite time consuming, because you could have one session where they get familiar with the case, and then they will go home and look up, information, and then there's going to be another session. Sometimes it could be after a few days where they're going to put everything together. So it is time consuming. It does require some practice and some familiarity of the instructor with this particular small group modality. There is also the team-based learning. So that could be another option. It's used in many schools in the preclinical years, could integrate also basic and clinical sciences. students learn with this modality as well to work in teams. You can also use it to teach differential diagnosis and clinical reasoning. Now, this one, in contrast with the problem-based learning, is that, I mean, the students, they do prepare. And, you know, they will have the individual test, and then, you know, the group test, and then they get the feedback. And then there are going to be application focused exercises. So they will apply what they learn to other scenarios. So that is another option that you could use. The logistics also of the team-based learning, you do need a very large classroom where all the students can sit. You have enough tables. You have, you know, the screen for each of the teams. So it does require also the resources. There is also the case-based learning. So that is another modality. The difference between the case-based learning and the PBL, as I mentioned earlier, the PBL, it's really open inquiry. Students come in and it's all new knowledge. They are not prepared, and the facilitator is just sort of, you know, is there but takes a back seat. The case-based learning, the facilitator really has a role that guides the group. So the students, they can be taught in small groups, and it's one modality that you can use if you want the students to develop critical thinking skills, and then what they learn, they can apply it to new cases. But it does require preparation. The students, they have to prepare, and also the faculty has to prepare in advance to make this type of small group the case-based learning effective. Role play, it is another modality. It can be fun. It can really promote active learning. And some scenarios would be if, you know, your goal is to teach the student interpersonal skills, communication. So some examples you can use role play is if you want the students to learn how to deliver bad news, for example, practice motivational interviewing. So those are some things that you can easily use role play. You can incorporate it into your small group. And that's a good way for the learners to develop their interpersonal skills. But you have to keep track of time, because you really want all the students to have an opportunity to participate in the role play. And it is important to give them feedback. And it does help to have a checklist for the person, the observer. And that checklist is the same for all the observers. So you try to standardize that feedback. Educational games is another teaching method. It can be fun. Students can work in teams if you want to set it up that way. Again, you have to have preset rules. And it's also a way for them to learn how to make decisions, think about a patient, about a differential diagnosis, about next steps, treatment plan. And it could be a nice supplement for other teaching methods. Online learning, well, there is so much now about online learning. When I wrote this chapter, that was, well before the pandemic, but now everyone has become really familiar with using online learning for large groups, like the webinar today. For small groups, it has been used for simulation. We've used it at the school here for our OSCEs, especially when our students had been removed from the clinical environment. So there are so many different ways you can use online teaching modalities. They could be synchronous, but they can also be asynchronous. Often that could be a good way to deliver content that it's very comparable. Like an example, if you have clerkship students at different sites, you can get them all together and you have the same instructor, discussing cases one afternoon every week. So all the students really have the same opportunity to hear the same instructor delivering the same content. You do need, as we all know, a lot of resources and really good IT support. It could also be a good platform, the online, for spaced learning, which could be a good way for learners to retain knowledge. So we use weekly quizzes to give you an example. So we see what they learn. Once they answer, they have, and they respond, they do have feedback, what the right answer is and why. And sometimes we find out as instructors that there is a content area that it seems like the class, they haven't really understood it. Then you can highlight this more in the course, and you can have additional quizzes covering this particular area. And as we all know, sometimes when you teach online, it could be quite challenging. So trying to keep everyone engaged. How much content do you want to deliver? Leave some time for discussion, use cases, ask student questions. So those are some ways that you can try to make the session more engaging. And then there are the virtual patients, the simulations. So those could be really helpful when you want to teach students how to interpret data, how they can come up with differential diagnosis and treatment plans. And it's also a good modality if you have, for example, clerkship students who have not encountered certain patient presentations. So they can actually go online and go through virtual patients' cases. And we did that when our students had been removed from the clinical setting. We did use online, we did use virtual patients, so they could have that learning through the online cases. It is also useful for managing the cognitive load, and then the students, they can pace themselves, so they can, go online and watch those cases at their convenience from home. So it is a modality that it's more convenient for the students as well. And there are also the portfolios, and I wasn't quite sure in the audience how you use them. So for this particular question, how do you use portfolios in your medical school curriculum? You could select all that apply. So if you use them to track developmental progress over time, or as a basis for feedback, or to foster student skills in self-assessment, or as a way to track student-patient encounters and procedures, or to archive student grades and evaluations. And then if you don't use portfolios, you can just select the last. So it's interesting because it seems that the majority, 67% actually don't use portfolios. And then probably, so 1/4, I see 25% use it to provide a basis for feedback. And then the rest, they're 17% to archive students' grades and evaluations, and also to track patient encounters and procedures. And then only 13% to track the developmental progress over time. Yeah, there are still a lot of schools that are not using the portfolios. And as you know, the answer options, those are all the ways you could actually use portfolios. So a way to track the students' developmental progress over time, and this perhaps becomes even more timely with all the discussion about entrustable professional activities and where each student is and how can you help the individual student progress. It is a very good way to provide feedback, and also it does help the learner self-assess. I mean, they look at the evaluations, they reflect on those, so it could help with the learner's development of professional identity, if you will, and their personal growth. It is a way to track patient encounters and the procedure log for the students. I have been a portfolio coach or portfolio advisor for a clerkship student. So the way we were using the portfolio, the students in the internal medicine clerkship, I'm an internist, they were uploading their history and physicals and their progress notes and reflections. So as a portfolio advisor, I was providing feedback, and that was really helpful to them, and it was supplementing the feedback that they were receiving from their ward attending or from their clinic preceptor. The students really liked it, but it does require time and also trained faculty. So it's helpful to have a pool of very dedicated teaching faculty, and needs a lot of support because it does take a lot of time, especially if you have many students who you review portfolios and you give feedback on. And there are also the discussion boards that they have become even more popular since I wrote that chapter. They are more often used. I have used discussion boards, and it's a good way to have a question for the group of students you work with, or for the class if you teach year 1 and 2, and then you stimulate the discussion and they exchange ideas and perspectives. But you really have to monitor the discussion. You have to keep it going. So it does require a skilled facilitator. And the environment has to be, sort of very professional, what they write and how they write their opinions. And also you have to be very mindful of the privacy issue, especially if they will be discussing patient presentations, for example. And the very last part of this presentation, I will talk very briefly a little bit about the importance of the setting, especially as it relates to the clinical setting in particular. And I would like to ask the question, which of the following would best describe your teaching role? are you primarily teaching in the clinic, in the hospital, both, or you don't have any teaching responsibilities? And if none of those applies, you can select the very last answer. So it's interesting because there is a good split, and it seems like 42% is other, but we do have, so 90% teaching in the hospital, 12% in the clinic, and then there's 15% both, and 12% they don't have any teaching responsibilities. So as we all know, balancing teaching responsibilities and patient care, that is a very big challenge. And it's the same if you teach in the clinic or you teach on wards. It's just that, you know, there's never enough time. So I think it is helpful to set expectations up front, explain how, you know, the structure of the session would be in the clinic, or how we're gonna do the rounds on wards, so everyone is on the same page. And also learning objectives. I often ask the learners I work with, I mean, what are the things you want to learn? Are there any areas that you want us to highlight while you work with me in the clinic? So that also gives me a good idea, like where does my learner stand? Are there any knowledge gaps that I will have to address? Does this particular learner have specific needs? And it is important to keep your student engaged. I mean, you don't want your student to shadow or just sit and observe in the clinic. You want them to have hands-on experience and participate. And it is important, even if it's just 1 minute feedback, it is important to provide feedback frequently and in a way that it is constructive, and make sure you do acknowledge the fact that you are giving feedback to the learner. So in the ambulatory setting, some ways that you can sort of in a very small amount of time teach is just teach in small increments. I mean, we cannot teach everything in one clinic session. There is so much time. So if there is, you know, a teaching point, I'll just highlight it. If there's a patient who comes in, has some remarkable physical findings, I'll take the student with me, show those findings. So those are small things that the students really enjoy, and you can still deliver a lot of content in a way that it's meaningful to the students. There are also some instructional models that you can, I don't know how many of you have used the 1 minute preceptor. I use it very often. It's very helpful in the clinic. In like 5 minutes, you can have the learner tell you what, you know, the learner thinks that is going on with the patient. I ask, okay, so why do you think this is the, you know, the diagnosis, or why do you think this is the case? Could it be something else? And then I find that 1 minute, you know, step, that opportunity to teach something, a general principle, something that it's relevant to the patient. And it is important to give feedback, and you want to give some positive feedback before you address any deficiencies or any errors, and then always make sure that you do provide some suggestions for improvement. Snaps also, it's another modality that is good if you also want to stimulate self-directed learning, because for that particular modality, the learner will actually select a topic in the end, that it's relevant to the patient, and go home and look up the, that particular content area, and then comes back next day and you can sort of ask the learner what he or she learned. Case presentations are always nice to incorporate in your teaching, and those are good for the ambulatory and also for the inpatient setting. You can also consider having the student present in front of the patient at the bedside, but be mindful of the patient and make sure that this is okay with the patient. And that it is also a good way for the patient to participate in the decisions that are being made for his or her care. And this is also a good way, the case presentations, for the student to practice oral presentations and get feedback. And the inpatient setting, it is also a great venue if you're planning interprofessional activities. I mean, that's a wonderful setting for that type of education. They work as a team. They appreciate the other health professions. So this is a very nice way for IPE as well. So some very, few highlights in selecting the most appropriate instructional methods. So always consider the content, the learners, the setting, the time, and the resources you have available when you try to think about the best instructional method. Keep in mind that the learners bring previous experiences, and also they have different learning needs. And try to blend instructional methods and do that appropriately. And it's always key to keep the learners engaged. So thank you very much. And I will be happy to take any questions.
So if people want to unmute and just ask a question, if they've got any, that'd be fantastic.
Yeah, hi, my name is Niall Johnston. I was wondering, is there a current or future role for third-party case-based learning solutions in preclinical and clerkship years? And is there a distinction between how third-party case-based learning solutions might be used in those two different scenarios?
So Dr. Johnson, when you mean third-party solutions, could you provide some examples?
Yeah, I was thinking not homegrown solutions developed by in-house clinicians, but developed by publishers.
Yes, so absolutely. And I mean, we do use at my school, we do use a lot of those third-party solutions. I mean, and I don't know for the for the copyright, I mean, mentioning the specific ones, but we do use several of those. We actually have used third-party solutions that, we flip the classroom. It's a good way to flip the classroom. So they will review a lot of content. They will be very familiar with it, and then we will have either a large group or a small group discussion. And what we try to do is really to synthesize that content. So we'll make it applicable to a case, a clinical case. They will answer questions, because these days, I mean, there are so many resources out there. So, I mean, they can read a lot of that content online. So I think a role these days is more how to put this together, how to help them synthesize, how to be able to reflect on this and then apply it to, a new case presentation. We also use a lot of those third-party resources for like board style review questions. And we use several of those as a way to reinforce the learning. Even for the quizzes that I mentioned earlier, we do actually at my school, we use a third party for that as well. So what we do is we do blend, as you said, I mean, the homegrown, they can be wonderful, but there are so many other resources. So you can even blend the outside with, you know, the ones you have, like the homegrown ones that the faculty, they create.
Thank you.
Any other questions? If not, thank you all for attending. And Irene, thank you very much for the presentation. I'll be emailing everybody a quick evaluation form to fill out shortly. And the link will be going up on the Alliance for Clinical Education website probably tomorrow, once I get everything downloaded.
Thank you all very much.